else would you end up in some neglected patch of weeds?
Well, now I might just take you up on that offer, sis.
Tarantino doesn't throw the word masterpiece around lightly, especially when it comes to John Wayne movies. But there are a few westerns, he says, every filmmaker should study. Number 7. Red River. When Quentin Tarantino talks about John Wayne movies that deserve the word masterpiece, Red River always enters the conversation, not just because it's a great western, but because it quietly redefined what a western hero could be. Released in 1948 and directed by Howard Hawks, the film tells the story of Thomas Dunson, a ruthless cattle rancher who sets out to drive 10,000 head of cattle from Texas to Missouri. That journey becomes one of the most dangerous and psychologically tense cattle drives ever put on screen. What Tarantino loves about Red River is the way it dismantles the myth of the flawless frontier hero. John Wayne had already become the embodiment of Western masculinity by the time the film was made. Audiences expected him to be strong, honorable, and morally steady. Red River gives them something far more unsettling. Dunson is brilliant and determined, but he is also tyrannical, obsessive, and increasingly unstable. The cattle drive begins as a practical business decision. The ranch has cattle but no market, and the only solution is to move the herd hundreds of miles north. But the trail becomes something else entirely. Dust storms, stampedes, starvation, and exhaustion push the men to their limits. And under that pressure, Dunson's leadership begins to crack. Tarantino has often talked about how great westerns treat the frontier as a psychological battlefield, not just a physical one. Red River does exactly that. Dunson becomes obsessed with maintaining control. Punishments become harsher. Orders become absolute. The men start to fear him as much as the dangers of the trail. That tension eventually erupts into mutiny. Montgomery Clift's character, Matt Garth, challenges Dunson's authorities and takes command of the drive. For audiences in 1948, this was shocking. A Western hero losing control of his men wasn't something the genre usually allowed. Tarantino has praised that narrative courage for exposing the darker side of frontier leadership. The film also influenced how Western action was staged. The stampede sequence remains one of the most impressive moments in classic Western cinema. Hundreds of cattle thunder through the night, crushing everything in their path. The chaos feels real because it was real. Hawks staged the sequence with practical effects and massive herds, creating a sense of scale that modern westerns still struggle to replicate. Tarantino often points to moments like that as reminders of how physical old Hollywood filmmaking was. There is no digital safety net, just dust, animals, and actors standing in the middle of controlled chaos. But the real masterpiece element of Red River lies in its characters. Dunson is not simply defeated when the mutiny happens. He continues hunting the men who betrayed him, determined to reclaim his authority. The final confrontation between Dunson and Garth is less about fists or guns and more about ideology. It's a clash between two visions of leadership. Older westerns often treated authority as sacred. Red River suggests something more complicated. Leadership can curdle into tyranny, strength can become stubbornness, and the frontier rewards adaptability, not just force. That complexity is exactly the kind of storytelling Tarantino admires. Because beneath the cattle drives, the gun belts, and the wide-open plains, Red River is really a story about power, ego, and the cost of control. And once you see it that way, it's impossible not to understand why Tarantino calls it a masterpiece. Number 6. The Searchers. When Quentin Tarantino talks about the greatest westerns ever made, The Searchers almost always enters the conversation. Not just as a great John Wayne film, but as one of the most influential movies in the entire history of cinema. Released in 1956 and directed by John Ford, the film follows Ethan Edwards, a Confederate veteran who returns home after the Civil War, only to lose his family in a brutal Comanche raid. His young niece Debbie is kidnapped during the attack, and Ethan spends years searching the frontier to find her. That premise sounds like classic Western material. A hardened gunslinger rides into hostile territory to rescue a captive. But Tarantino has often pointed out that The Searchers is not really about rescue. It's about obsession. Ethan Edwards is not the noble hero audiences expect. John Wayne had built his reputation playing courageous men who embodied frontier virtue. In The Searchers, that image fractures. Ethan is bitter, proud, and deeply prejudiced. His mission to find Debbie slowly transforms into something darker. At several moments in the film, Ethan openly suggests that if Debbie has been living with the Comanche for too long, She may be better off dead. That line of thinking was shocking for audiences in the 1950s. Western heroes were not supposed to carry that kind of moral poison. But Tarantino has praised The Searchers precisely because it refuses to sanitize its protagonist. Ethan is brave and resourceful, but he is also damaged by war and hatred. The search itself stretches across years. Seasons change, landscapes shift. The men following Ethan grow older and more tired. The film captures the endless scale of the American frontier, where distance becomes a character in its own right. Tarantino has often talked about how visually powerful the film is. John Ford shoots Monument Valley like a mythic stage, with massive red cliffs towering over the characters. Riders appear as tiny figures against the horizon, emphasizing how small humans are compared to the land they attempt to conquer. The film's famous opening and closing shots are some of the most iconic images in Western history. A door opens to reveal the vast desert outside, framing Ethan as he rides into the landscape. At the end of the film, that same doorway frames him again, but this time he remains outside. The family reunites inside the house, while Ethan turns away and walks back into the wilderness. Tarantino loves that ending, because it captures something essential about the Western hero. The man who saves civilization often cannot belong to it. Ethan's violence and obsession make him effective on the frontier, but they also make him incompatible with domestic life. The action sequences in The Searchers are also striking for their realism. Ambushes feel chaotic rather than choreographed. Gunfights are quick and dangerous. The violence serves the story rather than dominating it. But what truly makes the film a masterpiece in Tarantino's eyes is its emotional ambiguity. When Ethan finally finds Debbie after years of searching, the moment is filled with enormous tension. For a split second, it seems like he might kill her rather than bring her home. The audience realizes that Ethan's journey has never been purely heroic, and then the moment shifts. Instead of violence, Ethan lifts Debbie into his arms and says, "Let's go home." That single line carries the weight of years of rage, grief, and transformation. Tarantino has pointed out that very few Westerns dare to explore such complicated emotional territory. The Searchers is not just a story about revenge or rescue. It is a story about hatred, redemption, and the lonely cost of living by the gun. And for Tarantino, that kind of complexity is exactly what turns a great Western into a masterpiece. Number 5. Rio Bravo. When Quentin Tarantino talks about John Wayne movies that deserve the title of masterpiece, Rio Bravo almost always comes up. Not because it's the biggest Western ever made, but because it might be the most perfectly constructed one. Released in 1959 and directed by Howard Hawks, the film follows Sheriff John T. Chance, played by John Wayne, as he arrests the brother of a powerful rancher for murder. The arrest sets off a quiet war. The rancher surrounds the town with hired guns and waits for the moment to break his brother out of jail. What makes Rio Bravo special in Tarantino's eyes is its simplicity. There's no epic cattle drive, no sweeping war between armies. The entire story unfolds in a single town, a sheriff, a prisoner in a jail cell. A gang is waiting outside. The tension builds slowly, almost casually, until violence becomes inevitable. Tarantino has often said that Rio Bravo is one of the best examples of pure storytelling discipline. The movie understands that suspense doesn't come from constant action, it comes from waiting. Wayne's Sheriff Chance refuses outside help from the town's civilians. He believes it's his responsibility to handle the situation with the small group of people he trusts. That group includes a drunken deputy trying to redeem himself, a young gunfighter eager to prove himself, and an old, crippled jailer who still insists on doing his part. What Tarantino loves about the film is the sense of camaraderie between these characters. Many Westerners focus entirely on conflict. Rio Bravo spends time showing the relationships between the men defending the jail. They joke with each other, they argue, they share quiet moments of mutual respect. By the time the violence finally arrives, the audience understands exactly what's at stake. John Wayne's performance is also key to why Tarantino considers the film a masterpiece. Chance is not a flashy hero. He is steady, calm, and confident in his role as sheriff. Wayne plays him with relaxed authority. He rarely raises his voice, rarely shows fear, and never overplays the character. Tarantino has often said that this kind of controlled performance is harder to pull off than a showy one. Another reason Rio Bravo stands out is the pacing. Howard Hawks allows scenes to breathe. Characters sit around the jailhouse talking. They share drinks. They sing songs. These moments might seem slow in a modern action film, but Tarantino believes they are essential. They create a sense of normal life under threat. When the shooting finally begins, it matters. The action itself is straightforward and practical. Gunfights happen quickly, bullets feel dangerous. The choreography avoids flashy spectacle and instead focuses on clarity. Hawks wants the audience to understand exactly who is where and why every shot matters. Tarantino has also pointed out that Rio Bravo influenced countless later filmmakers. The idea of a small group of professionals defending a location against overwhelming odds became a blueprint for many action films. Even movies outside the Western genre borrowed its structure, but the real magic of Rio Bravo is its tone. Despite the danger surrounding the town, the film never becomes grim or cynical. There is humor, warmth, and even romance woven into the story. The characters are under pressure, but they remain human. That balance between tension and personality is incredibly difficult to achieve. Too much seriousness, and the story becomes heavy. Too much humor, and the danger disappears. Rio Bravo finds the perfect middle ground. For Tarantino, that kind of balance is the mark of true craftsmanship. It's a film where every scene serves the story, every character feels essential, and every moment builds toward a satisfying payoff. It may not be the loudest Western ever made, but it might be the most perfectly built. Number 4. Stagecoach. When Quentin Tarantino talks about John Wayne movies that changed cinema, Stagecoach always lands near the top of the list. Not just because it made Wayne a star, but because it helped reinvent the Western itself. Released in 1939 and directed by John Ford, Stagecoach arrived at a time when Westerns were mostly low-budget B-movies. They were short, simple, and often treated as disposable entertainment. Ford had a different vision. He wanted to make a Western with the scale, drama, and character depth of a major Hollywood production, and it worked. The story is deceptively simple. A stagecoach carrying a group of strangers must travel across dangerous territory while Apache warriors threaten the route. On board are a disgraced doctor, a pregnant officer's wife, a timid whiskey salesman, a gambler, a prostitute, and a fugitive named the Ringo Kid. That fugitive is played by John Wayne. Tarantino often points to Wayne's entrance in the film as one of the greatest star introductions in movie history. The stagecoach rolls across the desert, and suddenly the camera cuts to Wayne standing alone on the road, spinning a rifle in his hand. The camera pushes toward him as he raises the weapon and stops the coach. In that moment, a movie star is born. But Tarantino argues that what makes Stagecoach a masterpiece goes far beyond that iconic scene. The film takes a group of characters who would normally exist as stereotypes and gradually reveals their humanity. The drunken doctor turns out to be compassionate and intelligent. The gambler proves honorable. The woman ostracized by society becomes one of the most sympathetic characters in the story. Even Wayne's Ringo Kid is more complicated than a typical Western outlaw. He's polite, soft-spoken, and driven by revenge for the murder of his father and brother. The film allows him to carry both gentleness and violence simultaneously. Tarantino has often said that great Westerns treat the frontier as a pressure cooker for human behavior. Stagecoach does exactly that. The confined space of the coach forces the characters to confront their prejudices and assumptions about one another. Meanwhile, danger closes in. The Apache attack sequence near the end of the film remains one of the most thrilling action scenes of early Hollywood cinema. Horses thunder across the desert, while riders leap between moving vehicles, and gunfire erupts from every direction. Tarantino loves this sequence, not just for its spectacle, but for its clarity. Even though the action is chaotic, the audience always understands the geography of the chase. You know where the coach is. You know where the riders are. Every shot contributes to the momentum. John Ford's use of Monument Valley also changed the visual language of the Western forever. The towering red rock formations create a sense of mythic scale. Tarantino has often said that after Stagecoach, the American West in movies never looked the same again. But the film's real power lies in its storytelling discipline. Stagecoach moves quickly, yet it never feels rushed. Every character gets a moment to reveal who they truly are. By the time the final confrontation arrives, the audience cares about everyone on board. That combination of character depth and action spectacle became the template for for countless westerns that followed. Tarantino has pointed out that without Stagecoach, the western genre might never have been taken seriously by major filmmakers. It proved that frontier stories could carry emotional weight and cinematic ambition. And for John Wayne, it transformed him from a struggling actor into the face of American Western cinema. Sometimes a masterpiece isn't just a great film. Sometimes it changes an entire genre. Number 3. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. When Quentin Tarantino talks about westerns that truly deserve the label masterpiece, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is always near the top of the conversation. Not because it's the biggest or most visually spectacular John Wayne film, but because it might be the most honest. Released in 1962 and directed by John Ford, the movie tells the story of a legendary gunfight that supposedly turned a quiet lawyer named Ransom Stoddard into a national hero. According to the legend, Stoddard killed the outlaw Liberty Valance and brought law and order to a violent frontier town. But the film slowly reveals that the legend is not the truth. Tarantino has often praised The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance for dismantling the mythology most westerns had spent decades building. Instead of celebrating the gunfighter as the ultimate hero, the movie questions the entire idea of frontier legend. The story unfolds through flashbacks as an older Senator Stoddard returns to the town where his reputation was born. As he recounts the events of his youth, the audience learns that the famous gunfight did not happen the way history remembers it. The outlaw Liberty Valance was terrifying because he represented lawlessness in its purest form. He beat people publicly, bullied entire towns, and ruled through fear. Stoddard, a lawyer who believed in courts and justice, was completely unprepared for such brutality. John Wayne's character, Tom Doniphan, understands the reality of the frontier. He knows that law books don't stop violent men, only guns do. That tension between civilization and violence sits at the heart of the film. Tarantino has often said that great westerns are really about the birth of society in a lawless place. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance takes that idea and pushes it further than almost any other film. The famous duel between Stoddard and Liberty Valance is framed like the classic western showdown. Two men stand in the street, the town watches, guns are drawn. But later, the film reveals what actually happened. Stoddard did not kill Valance alone. The fatal shot came from the shadows, fired by Doniphan, who understood that Stoddard represented the territory's future. For that future to exist, the legend had to belong to the lawyer, not the gunman. Tarantino loves this twist because it exposes how myths are created. The town believes Stoddard is the man who killed Liberty Valance, and that belief helps him build a political career. Newspapers print the story, voters celebrate him. History is built on a version of events that never truly happened. The film's most famous line captures this idea perfectly. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend. Tarantino has often pointed out that this line might summarize the entire Western genre. For decades, Westerns told stories about heroic gunfighters taming the frontier. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance suggests that those stories might be comforting myths rather than reality. John Wayne's performance as Tom Doniphan is also central to why the film works. Doniphan is strong, confident, and deeply aware that the world he understands is disappearing. Civilization will replace men like him with politicians, judges, and institutions. In the end, Doniphan saves the town, but receives no credit. He fades into obscurity, while the legend belongs to someone else. For Tarantino, that bittersweet ending is exactly what makes the film a masterpiece. It recognizes that the frontier was built not just by heroes, but by complicated people making difficult choices. And sometimes the truth behind those choices is too messy to become history. Number 2. True Grit. When Quentin Tarantino talks about John Wayne films that truly deserve the word masterpiece, True Grit always enters the conversation. It's not simply because the film is entertaining or iconic. For Tarantino, it represents a rare moment where the John Wayne persona evolved without losing its mythic power. The result is a Western that feels both classic and quietly modern. Released in 1969 and directed by Henry Hathaway, True Grit follows Rooster Cogburn, a grizzled United States Marshal hired by a determined young girl named Maddie Ross. Maddie's father has been murdered by a drifter named Tom Chaney, and she is absolutely committed to seeing him brought to justice. When she looks for someone capable of hunting him down, she deliberately chooses Rooster because she has heard that he is the toughest and most ruthless marshal available. That reputation defines the character from the beginning. Rooster is not polished or heroic in the traditional sense. He drinks heavily, speaks bluntly, and carries the physical wear of years spent enforcing the law in brutal frontier conditions. Tarantino has often pointed out that this roughness makes Rooster fascinating. He is technically a lawman, but he operates with the instincts of a gunfighter. What makes the film special is the relationship that develops between Rooster and Maddie. Maddie is young, but she refuses to be dismissed. She negotiates contracts, demands accountability, and insists on joining the pursuit of Chaney. Her stubborn determination clashes constantly with Rooster's cynical worldview. Tarantino has often said that the best westerns create tension not just through gunfights, but through personalities. In True Grit, that tension comes from the contrast between Maddie's moral certainty and Rooster's hard-earned pragmatism. She believes deeply in justice. Rooster believes in results. As the journey unfolds, their relationship slowly shifts. Rooster initially sees Maddie as a nuisance, but he gradually comes to respect her resolve. That emotional progression gives the film weight beyond its revenge plot. The action sequences reinforce Rooster's legend without turning him into a cartoon hero. The most famous moment occurs when he charges a group of outlaws alone, reins clenched between his teeth, while he fires two weapons at once. The image has become one of the defining shots of Western cinema. Tarantino has praised this scene not only for its spectacle, but for how naturally it grows out of Rooster's character. It is reckless, bold, and completely in line with the man we have been watching. Yet the film's most powerful moments come near the end, when the story shifts from vengeance to survival. After Chaney is confronted, Maddie falls into a pit and is bitten by a rattlesnake. Rooster suddenly finds himself racing across the wilderness to save her life. The journey strips away the swagger that defined him earlier in the film. What remains is a man driven by loyalty and responsibility. John Wayne's performance earned him the Academy Award for Best Actor. And Tarantino has often said that the recognition felt like a career-long acknowledgement. Wayne had played Western heroes for decades, but True Grit allowed him to reveal vulnerability beneath the legend. For Tarantino, that balance between myth and humanity is exactly what elevates the film to masterpiece status. Number 1. The Shootist. When Quentin Tarantino talks about John Wayne films that deserve to be called masterpieces, he often gravitates toward movies that do something deeper than simply celebrate the Western myth. For Tarantino, the truly great Westerns are the ones that examine the myth itself. That's exactly why The Shootist stands at the very top of the list. Released in 1976 and directed by Don Siegel, The Shootist is widely known as John Wayne's final film. But Tarantino has often pointed out that calling it merely Wayne's last movie undersells what it actually accomplishes. The film is not just the end of Wayne's career, it's the final chapter of the entire classical Western era. The story centers on J.B. Brooks, an aging gunfighter who arrives in Carson City quietly and without ceremony. Brooks carries a reputation that precedes him. For decades, he has been known as one of the fastest and deadliest men in the West. His name alone is enough to intimidate criminals and attract curious onlookers. But when the film begins, the legend is already fading. Brooks learns that he is dying of cancer. The diagnosis is not ambiguous. The doctor explains that the illness is terminal and painful. There will be no miracle cure, no sudden recovery, no heroic last stand against nature. The film confronts mortality directly, which immediately separates it from most Westerns of its time. Tarantino has often said that what makes The Shootist extraordinary is its honesty in treating the gunfighter myth. For decades, Western heroes have been portrayed as invincible figures who rode away after every gunfight untouched. Brooks represent the opposite reality. He is old, he is tired, and his body is failing him. Despite his reputation, Brooks spends much of the film quietly living in a boarding house owned by a widow named Bond Rogers and her son Gillum. Their home becomes the emotional center of the story. Through everyday conversations and shared meals, the audience begins to see the human being behind the legend. Tarantino loves these scenes because they strip away the traditional Western spectacle. Instead of endless shootouts and horseback chases, the film focuses on character. Brooks is polite, thoughtful, and deeply aware that the life he lived came with consequences. The boarding house owner initially fears him because of his reputation. She sees him as a violent relic of the past. But as the days pass, she begins to understand that Brooks is far more complicated than the stories suggest. The town itself reacts differently. Once word spreads that the famous gunfighter is dying, opportunists begin circling. Some want to challenge him in order to build their own reputations. Others simply want to witness the fall of a legend. The myth of the gunfighter becomes a kind of public spectacle. Tarantino has often pointed out how modern that idea feels. Fame, even violent fame, attracts attention long after the person at the center of it has grown weary. Books understand this better than anyone. Rather than waiting for the illness to slowly destroy him, he decides to control the ending of his story. He arranges one final confrontation with the men who are hunting his reputation. If he must die, he wants it to happen on his own terms. But the film never treats that decision as heroic. It feels inevitable. Throughout the story, Wayne plays Brooks with remarkable restraint. There is none of the booming authority that defined many of his earlier roles. Instead, his voice is quieter, his movements are slower, every gesture feels deliberate. Tarantino has often said that Wayne's performance in The Shootist works because it acknowledges the actor's real-life legacy. By the time the film was made, Wayne had been the face of Western cinema for decades. Audiences brought that history into the theater with them. The film uses that history. In the opening moments, a montage of scenes from Wayne's earlier westerns plays across the screen. Gunfights, horseback chases, and frontier landscapes flash by like memories. Tarantino has praised this sequence because it transforms Wayne's entire career into the backstory of J.B. Brooks. It's not just a character's past we're seeing. It's the past of the Western genre itself. The final act of the film unfolds in a saloon where Brooks confronts the men who want to challenge him. The gunfight that follows is quick and brutal. There is no triumphant music, no sense of glorious victory. It's simply the end. Brooks manages to defeat his opponents, but the effort drains the last of his strength. As he collapses, the young boy Gillum picks up the gun and kills the final attacker. Then he throws the weapon away. That moment carries enormous symbolic weight. The next generation refuses to continue the cycle. Tarantino has often said that this ending represents the closing of a chapter in American cinema. The gunfighter era is over. The myths that once defined the West are fading. But rather than mocking those myths, the Shootist honors them. It recognizes that the legends of the frontier shaped generations of storytelling, even if they were never entirely true. And standing in the center of that farewell is John Wayne himself. Older, quieter, and more human than ever before. For Tarantino, that combination of personal history, emotional depth, and genre reflection is exactly what makes The Shootist a masterpiece. It's not just a great John Wayne film, it's the final word on the entire Western legend. Quentin Tarantino has always admired filmmakers who understood genre at its deepest level, and John Wayne's greatest westerns are perfect examples of that craft. These films didn't just define the frontier myth, they examined it, challenged it, and sometimes even dismantled it. From the raw psychological tension of Red River to the elegiac farewell of The Shootist, each movie represents a different stage in the evolution of the Western hero. For Tarantino, these aren't simply entertaining classics. They're essential pieces of cinematic DNA. Every modern Western, every morally complex gunslinger, and every filmmaker who studies the genre owes something to these John Wayne masterpieces.